Well, friends, welcome back to the Space for Faith podcast. My name is Mike Goldsworthy, and it is good to have you with us today. And I am looking forward to introducing you all to a new friend of mine, Micha Boyett. And I met a couple of months ago this summer. I was in New York, and a mutual friend introduced us. And Micha, I wanted to get to hear more about your work and about what you're doing. And I thought this would be a fun way to get to do some of that, and that you put out a recent book, and so I thought, like, this is a great way for us to get to know each other a little bit, was to get to chat on here. So thanks for making some time today.
Well, I'm honored. Thanks for having me, Mike.
Yeah, and obviously this is not your first book. For those of you who don't know Micha, she is the author of Found, A Story of Questions, Grace, and Everyday Prayer. She contributed to the New York Times bestseller, A Rhythm of Prayer, that Sarah Bessey put together and edited. She also helps on a couple of podcasts. She co-hosts the Lucky Few podcast, created the Slow Way podcast and newsletter, writes for Washington Post and Christianity Today, and also, in addition to being a writer, you're the youth pastor at the lovely, wonderful church Good Shepherd Church in New York. And I also found out while reading the book that you were an elder at our apparently mutual friend Fred Harrell's church, City
Aw.
Church in San Francisco. So, yeah,
Yes, we haven't talked about that.
we haven't.
Yeah.
Well,
I
you
was
seem
there
like,
for a long time.
yeah, it's so much of your story. I'm sure we'll get into some of that. But yeah, it seems like you have a busy life.
It's a little bit busy.
You
A
got a
little
few
bit.
things going on. You got
Yeah.
kids. You got all the stuff.
Yeah. So that's why I'm always trying to write about slowing down. I don't know that I've figured it out yet, but I'm trying.
But it's aspirational.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that's how I've been trying to figure out, I've been wanting to call myself like an aspirational mystic or something, but I feel like it actually sounds like further along than where I actually am, that it's like, oh, those are nice ideas that I like to read
Yeah.
about, and that I'm so much farther away from what reality is.
Yeah. I feel that too. I always feel like I write about prayer because I haven't gotten the hang of it yet. And yeah, writing about it for like 15 years, but still haven't gotten the hang of it
And you haven't
yet.
figured it out yet? Well, so your newest
Stuff out
book,
there.
yeah, Blessed Are the Rest of Us, came out earlier this year. And genuinely, I loved the book. I thought it was thoughtful and challenging and really engaging. And here's how I've been describing it to people. And I'm curious if you feel like I'm doing it justice, or if you've got a different way of talking about it. But I've been telling people that it's a thoughtful engagement of the Beatitudes, but using the lens of your son, who has Down syndrome and autism, as a framework for engaging them. And that it feels to me like it's part memoir, part theology.
That's exactly how I've been describing it too. Yeah.
Look at that.
And I think it kind of depends on who I'm talking to. I I tend to think of myself as a creative nonfiction writer, and that memoir is kind of my genre. But I really wanted to be able to go deep into theology, and it's a mix, and it is a little tricky to define. But I really loved going going into the words of Jesus with this experience and image of my son at the forefront, because that's how I've come to understand his value and beauty in this world, and how I've come to understand my own. And Jesus's words in the Beatitudes have become really the blueprint for what it means to me to follow Jesus and live a life of faith.
Huh. Yeah, I'm curious, how did you stumble across, or maybe it wasn't even stumbling, but how did you end up in the place where you started seeing the intersection of those two things, where that became a sort of awakening for you there?
Yeah. I don't think it was like an epiphany moment. I share in the book that Ace is my youngest son. I have three boys. And I was 5 months pregnant when I received his Down syndrome diagnosis, a prenatal diagnosis. And that was a time of grief and turmoil, and really until Ace showed up in the world, and I was like, oh, it's you. I know you. And then he was not a diagnosis. He was my baby. And the world kind of shifted from this fear of what it was going to mean to raise a child with a disability to recognizing that I needed to protect him from this world that didn't see him the way that I saw him. I think that I'm always trying to find language. It's sort of my MO to be like, what does this mean? How do I say this? What am I experiencing? And the more that I began to kind of understand my role as ACE's advocate, the more I just kind of began to come back over and over internally to the Beatitudes. It wasn't even like I started reading them. It was like they rose to the surface for me. And it was this thing in scripture that, like, organically, I just began to hold onto. And I think, I've always found my life in Jesus's teachings, but it was, I think it was Asa's meekness, like this idea of meekness, the way that the world views meekness as failure, and the way that Jesus speaks
Hmm.
of it as a great honor that began to reshape the way that I saw Ace's life and the way that I saw myself and my own failures and the things that I felt were wrong about me. And yeah, that led to transformation.
I love that. And the way that you describe it and even like the journey you take us on in the book is like really helpful and really moving. Like I want to hear about, and maybe I'll ask you about it in a minute, because you talk about hearing Nadia Bowles-Weber, a sermon that she gives that was really striking to me in a lot of ways, and then what it kind of did in you. But you said something there that I didn't want to miss also about talking about the ACE's meekness that opened up something in you. So I I grabbed this from your book. You said flourishing are the ones who release their power. And then later on, you write that meekness is a spiritual practice. It's having access to power, but choosing not to wield it for oneself. It's holding back our control, our comfort, our voice in order to give that privilege from another to another. And so you talk about the idea that one of the things that you learned from Ace is that because of his need and his lack of security, that his presence, that just his very presence invites us into a kind of like mutual reciprocity about power needing to be shared. So
Mhm.
I just wanted to like let you riff on that for a moment since you brought that up as like one of the things that was opening up in you.
Yeah. I think one of the things that is missing so much in our culture is the value of interdependence and just the reality that we need each other. And, I think we're all talking about community and trying to form community and then living in our big houses with our tiny families. And we're just all trying to figure it out. We're in a culture that has not taught us how to be interdependent. And then we have these moments, I think especially those of us who are white, who have lived through the last 10 years of really beginning to come to terms with just what life is like for our siblings of color and our Black siblings and our Indigenous siblings, like the things that we have, those of us who were like privileged enough to live in a bubble where we didn't see it. And then suddenly began to recognize that we have power. And what does it even mean to share it? Or what does it mean to make sure that everybody gets access? And I think that what ACE has given me in loving and caring for this child who was born without power and who I watch daily struggle to find his place in the world. Even his favorite place to be right now, we're recording at the end of the summer, and Ace and I go to the pool every day because it is like if he could have water therapy every day of his life, he would be
Yeah.
like his best self. And he just swims like a fish. And there are other kids at the pool. And sometimes all the kids know who he is, but he will swim up to them and like wait outside the circle. And my son is non-speaking. And it's like he doesn't know what to do next. And the kids don't always know what to do
Yeah.
next either.
Yeah.
But and I think there's this vision of, like, powerlessness. It's not that something's wrong with Ace, it's that the way that the rules are set up for how we engage with each other doesn't make space for us to know how to engage with someone who's different or someone who is not in the world we've grown up with. And that image of meekness there, like, there's the meekness that Ace is born into, it's just the powerlessness. But what those kids playing in the pool have an invitation to is the meekness, the, like, choice of choosing whatever they control they have of play in that moment, whatever power they have in their social structure in that moment, to turn and find a way to bring him in. And that is one of the hardest things I think humans can do for each other. I
Mm.
think that is why we are constantly having these conversations about, like, what does it mean for white folks like us to lay down our power and create a space of real equity in our workplaces, in the church, in society in general. And we're still figuring it out because meekness is really, really hard.
Yeah, I love that. I love even like the way that you frame that around. There's not something wrong with him. There's something wrong with the rules and the way that the rules are set up and that of like how we operate and just that lens of sort of looking outside of a person and and trying to figure out like okay, what is I don't know what the language that we use of like what's a normal person or something like that.
Right.
And
Right.
that gets defined by the kind of rules that we set up of like, this is how society should work, as opposed to like, what if everyone is a gift and that some of those gifts actually force us to have to ask new and different questions about those rules that maybe have worked in our favor. So we've never had to see them before, notice them before. They just kind of, it's the what is water. Like I'm just in the water. I don't know that it's there until
Yeah.
I allow myself to see someone in a way that forces me to have to or maybe doesn't even force me, where I choose to see it because of someone else.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what's beautiful about the Beatitudes is how invitational they are.
Hmm.
That it is Jesus is setting up this, what he calls the kingdom of God. And in it, it's not these, it's this beautiful invitational place of engaging. I talk in the book about our limits and our longings, engaging our weaknesses, recognizing that in those weaknesses, God is inviting us to become more fully who we've always been intended to be. And I I think that that's what is so cool about the Beatitudes is that you can just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper in them.
Yeah, and gosh, you keep making me want to go off on different streams than where I thought I would ask you. But like one of the things that I found really interesting, and this is like, there's a few things that like you nerd out on that I appreciate. And you can tell that there's a whole depth underneath it. And because you're such a gifted writer that like you show us what you need to show us, but like you write it in a way where you know, like, oh gosh, she's got so much more beneath this. She's just not showing us her work. And one of them was around like thinking about the Beatitudes as a poem
Mm.
and putting it in its kind of like historical cultural context in a way where it would have been viewed as a poem. Is that top of mind at all that you could like share a little bit about that?
Yeah. I love thinking about it as a poem. First, because my master's is in poetry. And so I'm a little bit of like a poetry nerd anyway. But it feels different than than most of Jesus's teachings. Most of the time he spoke in parables, most of the time he was answering questions. This is very recited, it feels to me. And so I was super excited when I was doing research and found information about like the Greco-Roman virtue tradition. And this I learned from Jonathan Pennington's work. And he talks about that this was really a typical oratory device that in the Greco-Roman period, teachers would stand up and they would kind of recite a meaningful, not necessarily a poem. Jonathan Pennington never says a poem, but that was sort of my add-on because that's the way that I see it. And in that, they would stand up and they would say, "This is the way to have a happy life." And that was the point of this device was I'm going to tell you about what it means to live a moral and fulfilling and flourishing life. And a lot of it was just, moral statements. Like if you're good to people, they'll be good to you. It's like keep your word and be a hard worker and those kinds of things. And so that's what is really fascinating about what Jesus is doing here because he is standing up and using this device that the people who are sitting in front of him would understand and recognize. And he's turning it on its head where it's not about this moral contractual obligation where you do good and you get good back. It's like, here's how to have a happy life. You who are grieving, you who are losing your power, you who are longing for a better world, like this is the way that we're going to find true human flourishing. And that was so helpful for me too in trying to get my head around this word blessed, which has a lot of baggage for me. And I imagine for your listeners, a lot of baggage. I have really struggled through my years of faith with this idea that it seems that God blesses some people and doesn't bless others, or that we pray hard enough and we get blessings, or that our kids make straight A's and everything's easy and that somehow means we're blessed. And it doesn't line up with the teaching of Jesus. And I really love this idea that what he's talking about when he uses this word blessed is wholeness, flourishing, true human happiness at the core. And which I think takes us back to that interdependence thing. We need each other. We find support with one another through our weaknesses. And we find what it means to really be human in the midst of these things that are painful and full of weakness and longing.
Yeah, that's really good. That's helpful. I feel like that way that you were looking at the Beatitudes, just purely out of a way of reading and engaging them, gave me another dimension that was a really helpful other dimension. I'd been pretty influenced by Willard and the
Hmm.
way that Willard would read them, and which I feel like has been helpful for me, but I've been realizing recently it's probably more of a doorway than it is the end of the road on how to engage
Mm.
them. And I'd been treating it for a while like it was the end of the road. And so I've needed some folks like you to open up some other doors that help me move it into some other places. So
Mm.
yeah, thanks. This is really helpful framing.
Saying that.
So I don't want to miss early in the book when you were mentioned the sermon that you heard Nadia give.
Yeah.
And she's talking about Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus. And I'll let you talk about that. I found it really both interesting and moving, which I it was both it's the way that I've been describing your book. It's both it's thoughtful, it's theological, and it's also memoir. It's also story and
Mm.
I thought the way that you engaged that felt like both of those things hitting. So yeah, do you mind sharing a little bit about that experience?
Sure. Yeah. This was at the Why Christian conference in 2019. It was actually just a few weeks before Rachel Held Evans passed
Mm-hmm.
away. And I was sitting in the audience. It's just like the last sermon, bringing the whole conference to its final moment. And Nadia's preaching, and she was just preaching from the liturgical passage for the week. And it is on Lazarus sitting at the table with Jesus after he's been raised from the dead. And it's when his sister Mary comes in and breaks the jar of perfume and cries and washes Jesus' feet. And she starts to ask these questions about, why in this situation where Mary would be seen. I mean, Mary is an unmarried woman. She has one brother, she and her sister Martha, and they all live together. So this brother is probably the man who is in charge of her, and in that culture would be her caregiver, her provider, all these things. And so she just starts to ask questions about, why is Lazarus at this table not saying anything? This is a, a man's dinner, and a woman should not be stepping in, and especially acting like the way that Mary's acting. And so she brings it back to when Lazarus dies and starts pointing out other details that were just really interesting to me. Like that Lazarus never speaks. He never speaks in any of the stories and there's a lot of stories about Mary and Martha and Lazarus and Jesus. And when Lazarus has died and Jesus shows up after the sisters have begged him to come and it takes him forever, he shows up and they're not, their anger at him feels a little different than just, it feels very protective. It feels very motherly. And and Nadia starts asking these questions about, okay, so Lazarus never speaks. The sisters are very protective of him, and there's kind of this sense of them as caregivers. And she says that her friend Doug, who is Doug Gay, a Scottish theologian, he asked once, what if Lazarus was a nonverbal man? And then Nadia takes it a step further. What if Lazarus is a nonverbal man with Down syndrome? And she asked this in front of the whole conference. And I was there as like, a minor teacher person. And I'm sitting kind of right there on the stage behind her. And she and I have never really talked. She doesn't know about my son. And at that point, Ace was 4 years old and had not spoken. And we were in the process of pursuing an autism diagnosis for him. And which kind of when that starts to happen with Down syndrome, it it becomes clear that, there's just like in any kind of disability, there's a wide range of what life can be like for a person with Down syndrome. There's like the people with Down syndrome that you hear about in the news who's like, this person with Down syndrome ran an Ironman triathlon, and this
Sure.
person with Down syndrome drives and is a lobbyist in Washington. And so there's like that kind of that kind of person whose disability has still allowed them to do things that we see as incredible. And then there are the people with Down syndrome who don't speak. There are the people with Down syndrome who struggle in ways that, don't make the news. And for me, it was becoming more and more clear that this vision I had kind of when Ace first got his Down syndrome diagnosis, I had done all this research where I was like, people with Down syndrome get married, and people with Down syndrome live on their own, and people with Down syndrome. And I was starting to come to terms for myself with like, this could be a really different story for Ace.
Mhm.
This could be a story where he doesn't talk, and maybe he doesn't learn how to read. And maybe he isn't the person with Down syndrome who gets married and lives on his own. And so when she said that, as I'm sitting in this sermon, and suddenly I have this image of Lazarus, the one person that Jesus weeps over openly, the person that he decides is worthy of bringing back to life, the person who sits beside him at this dinner as the guest of honor, like that Jesus would decide that it's this man with Down syndrome who doesn't speak, who is the one who's most valuable to be brought back. That was a confirmation for me of what I think I already was in the process of. What does it mean to live out the Beatitudes? What does it mean to live out this kind of upside down narrative of what it means to live a life that matters. And if this is true, it is the most true thing about Jesus, that he would choose this man, that Lazarus would be the best friend he saves.
Huh. Wow. Yeah, remember, I think you used language of like, you talked about Jesus having an inefficient view of the world, and that showed up in like who he chose to be around and who were his friends, and that even like though who he was friends with and who he chose to surround himself with would show his inefficient view of the world in
Mhm.
a way that should challenge our own lenses. And I found that really moving and a
Mm.
really helpful way of thinking about it. Yeah, I'm not really sure if there's a question here or not, other than like one of the things that like I was really struck by, and struck by also in your telling here the story, is that some folks I think can move to like my experience, and I don't have kids with those disabilities, so I don't have this experience of the world, but in pastoring I'd been with people whose kids would have some sort of diagnosis, and the lens that they would view it through is like, here's all of the deficiencies that they have, like here's how the world is going to be messed up for them, or here's how hard my life is now going to be that I have to deal with. And it was like sort of that. And then at the other end of the pendulum, that there are folks who maybe over sentimentalized
Mhm.
and sort of like over romanticized like their experience. And I found you having this like, I don't know how I'd say it, this like way that I felt like invited me into the story of you all with Ace in a way that saw Ace as a gift in not an overly sentimental way, but that challenged my notions and views of the world, while also recognizing like I did not ever feel like, oh, this is really easy for Micah and her family. I felt like this is this constant struggle and this constant like, where's the gift in the struggle?
Mhm.
Is that fair of reading?
Yeah, I mean, that's honestly a really wonderful thing to hear, because it's the balance I wanted to walk. I really do believe that Ace's disabilities are really hard for him and really hard for his family, and also it's not because something's wrong with him. It's because something's wrong with the world.
Hmm.
And I feel that and believe that in terms of the education system, in the way that we're taught how to socialize, in the way churches are set up. It's it's we there's something wrong with how we do it, not something wrong with Ace.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you saying that about not over sentimentalizing. We talk a lot, and so I'm part of this podcast, The Lucky Few, and it's a Down syndrome advocacy podcast, and it's me and two other women who have kids with Down syndrome. And there's a phrase in the disability community that is called inspiration porn. And have you ever heard that phrase?
No, but I immediately think I get it.
Yeah. It's this, like, the viral videos when the kid with the disability is gets asked to prom, and everybody, or the kid finishes the race. I mean, it's not none of the things are bad. It's a beautiful thing to celebrate, but the way that our culture kind of clings to them and thinks about it, or allowing people with disability to be an inspiration instead of people that we're in relationship with.
Yeah,
I think that's where that line is.
it's like it almost tokenizes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels like maybe out of a desire to do something good, you turn an actual human being into this like a figure or something.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I appreciate that. So, another thing I found really fascinating is probably like 3/4 of your book is is based out of like your personal experience with your child. And then there's this other portion of your book where you make some shifts about things that you wrestled with that did not necessarily come because of a direct thing with a child. So particularly around LGBT, the LGBTQ community, and talking about race and people of color. And neither of those were ones that like you were born with somebody that forced you to have to ask questions about your own life. And I'm curious about that shift from a lens that was so personal and something that you couldn't avoid and had to engage in, to other things that maybe weren't as personal, and that you could have maybe, if you had wanted to, you could have maybe chosen to avoid them. And a part of why I'm thinking about it is I'm thinking about people who become LGBTQ affirming after one of their kids comes out to them,
Mhm.
which I'm so appreciative of, and I'm so grateful that like they would allow their kid to like cause them to ask new and different questions, that they would love their kid enough to let something like that open up and to engage in that. But then I'm also like, one of the things is interesting to me are folks who don't have that experience but have chosen to ask some questions about other people's lives and how your own theology is affecting the life of other folks, that it's not as personal. And so
Yeah.
you didn't does that make sense?
Yeah,
So yeah,
absolutely.
so you make this shift away from this thing that like you needed to figure out and engage with, to one that you chose to.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a weird, I mean, in some ways, that's a weird chapter. The chapter just kind of like shows up and you're like, where did that come
You're
from?
like, "Hey
And
folks, we need to talk about our queer siblings, and I'm gonna make sure that you think about this."
yeah, let's pause the conversation about disability. Yeah, I think I honestly, I just felt I could not write about the Beatitudes, write about justice or peacemaking without engaging that part of my story. And I I honestly feel I'm so deeply formed by that part of my story that it shaped how I came to the kind of mother I became for Ace. And
Huh.
I was, in I talk about this is chapter 7. It's the peacemaking chapter. I was an elder in my church in San Francisco while I was pregnant with Ace, and was part of a decision to become for our church to become affirming. And it was a really messy, like painful, not just leadership experience, but a messy, painful experience for everyone in my church community. And it was not done perfectly. And it caused a lot of damage, both for the queer community and in those who don't identify as queer, those who are not ready for the church to make that decision. There's a lot to it. But as I look back, and I would never have said this then, I, it was that was a years long process for me of changing my theology that was happening before I was ever pregnant with Ace. But the fact that it all happened as like, we made that decision 6 weeks before Ace was born. I was kind of dealing with the fallout as an elder at the same time as I was on bed rest, waiting to have this kid with Down syndrome. Then I had a kid with Down syndrome, and the church was falling apart. And, I was trying to navigate the grief of what I was going through with Ace, and also the grief of what I was losing with church, and also angry phone calls, like all of those things at once. I I think of it so much as a grace that I began to ask the questions I started to ask in the years before Ace came around. Because it really is, for me, a story about justice, a story about vision for my neighbor, a story about who it is that the kingdom of God belongs to, and a story about privilege. And as a straight, white, upper middle class, cisgender woman in a happy marriage to a man, like there's so many things I didn't have to see or think about. And, one of the gifts was living for a decade in San Francisco where I um I just was honored to be in relationships with people all across like the LGBTQ spectrum. And forced to start asking questions about what I really believed Jesus wanted for them and what I believe Jesus wanted for our church. I think making that decision, going through the grief of that, was a gift in understanding just a tiny bit of what it felt like to be excluded, what it felt like to be othered. And I would I think I was ready in some way for having a child who is excluded and othered, even if it's in a totally different um
Yeah.
I don't know what the word is that I'm
Yeah.
looking for, but yeah.
Yeah. I appreciate that. And yeah, I appreciate the way that like you all work through that. And then you like one of the things you engage in quite a bit in talking about that is the relationship you had with some friends who were really hurt by the process, who were really invested in your church, and the way that you all walk through that together. And then later on, you talk about like the way that that relationship looks now or looked in the future, maybe after that. And I thought like that might be a really helpful way to like share a little bit of that in a moment where, we're heading into obviously a super contentious election.
Mm.
Britt Barron, do you know Britt?
Yeah, I don't
Okay.
know her, but I know who she is. Yeah.
Britt will be on the podcast here in a few weeks, and she has a new book coming out called "Do I Still Talk to Grandma?" And her like
Mm.
controlling story in it is
Yeah.
essentially a bunch of progressives sitting around a table. One of them says, "My grandma voted for Trump," and somebody else says, "Well, do you still talk to her?" And she's like, "My Nana? Yeah, I still
Yeah.
talk to her." So anyways, all that to sort of set up to say like we need to be thinking about like and figuring out friendships that we still want to fight for, and like how do we do that and what does that look like. And I thought like that you gave such a great picture there of that. I wondered if you don't mind just sharing a little bit about that.
No, I'm glad to. Yeah, so this is, in this chapter, I'm exploring Jesus's blessing on the peacemakers. And there's I can't remember the person's name who calls it living in the service of peace.
Hmm.
But I quote them in the book, and I think that's such a beautiful way to think about it, that we don't like peacemaking is not peacekeeping, it's not brushing things under the rug, it's not avoidance. It's really the opposite. It's leaning into the love that you have for the person and being unafraid to engage. And most of what I experienced when our church really split over this decision that I helped make was that the easiest, I mean, and it was painful for people to leave the church, but it felt too easy for them to leave the church too. It felt like, well, this is obviously a place where I don't belong anymore. And it was just like walking away without having the conversations. And my friends, Jared and Leah, who I talk about in the book, they just weren't willing to walk away. And we've never come to a place where we are exactly on the same page about queer relationships and, what the Bible says about it. But what they weren't willing to do was draw a line in the sand and say that their belief about truth would trump love. And I think that that's the most powerful place to be is like, are we willing to have the conversations, and who is valuable enough for us to have that with? And I think that, again, these things that Jesus invites us to in the Beatitudes are the hardest things. That making peace is something that has never happened on the earth yet. We've continually been a planet at war with one another because making peace involves our individual like humbling of ourselves and having the conversations, being willing to love each other, even if we can't find common ground in whatever the area is that we are struggling in. And so one of the visions that I had hoped for my church was that we could worship together and say, hey, this doesn't have to be the thing that breaks us apart. This can be a thing like, isn't it Romans 12, Mike, where Paul is talking about those of us who eat meat sacrificed to idols and those of us who don't, and we can still meet and worship together. And like, could we be a church that envisions that and lives that out? And for the most part, at that moment, our church couldn't be that. But there were a few people who caught that vision, and Jared and Leah really did. And so the big things that we had to work through were not necessarily that we were ever going to see eye to eye on this thing, but could we worship together? And we were able to find our way towards that. And I think one of the parts that I really love about the narrative of this book is that their son, who's born 2 days after Ace, really became, and it still is, Ace's dearest friend and the person who understands him. And like, even as they now live on two sides of the country, we were together this summer on vacation. And the way that I call Jonah and Ace together caretakers in the dream of God. When they are together, Jonah understands him and Ace feels safe and loved and known. And that is the kind of thing that I really believe is one of the highest values in the dream of God. And I'm getting to see that lived out in their lives. And that comes from this hard work of peacemaking that happened years and years ago.
Yeah, I love that. It was such a great picture. Well, Micha, where can folks find you on the internet that want to be paying attention to you and all of the 18 different things that you're putting out into the world?
Thanks. You can find me at michaboyett.com. I'm on Instagram at Micha Boyett and sometimes on Threads, though not super prolific over there. I also have a Substack called The Slow Way and put something out once a week over there. It's a contemplative prayer, like reflection and practice in that newsletter. And then you can also listen to the Lucky Few podcast if you're interested in disability advocacy and thinking about those things. And yeah, you can buy Blessed Are the Rest of Us wherever you find books.
Yes, please do support Blessed Are the Rest of Us. It's fantastic, genuinely. And what a gift to have you on here. Thanks for making time to do this today. And yeah, I'm really grateful for what you're putting out in the world. Thanks for the way that you show up.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thanks for having me.